gremlins! A few months ago, I made a video where I came up with some ideas for different upcycled clothing and jewelry I wanted to make eventually. I just sketched all my ideas digitally, and didn't create any physical clothing or accessories. You can watch that video here. Today, I finally have the resources and time to bring one of those designs to life. I found this brown t-shirt at a thrift store a while ago, but haven't had a chance to get around to painting it until now. The design is a cluster of animal skulls and moths, light browns and off-whites against dark brown fabric. I started by sketching each section of the design using watercolor pencil. I didn't film this process, as previously, when I filmed painting clothing, the sketches never show up on camera. This sketch actually does show up, but I didn't realize that until I started painting. This design took 2 days to paint. On the first day, I started late in the day and only had time to paint one layer. Because I'm painting light designs on a dark background, I started by laying down a layer of flat white paint within my outlines. Painting on top of white will mean I have to do less layers of paint to get the colours I want, and the less layers there are, the more this shirt will hold up through washes and wearing. This part of the process is fairly simple. I didn't follow any of the internal designs in my sketch, just the silhouettes of each moth and skull. I realised when editing that the camera kept refocusing and adjusting the brightness, which is annoying, but I can't do much about it now. Someday I'll get proper equipment, but for now I'm managing with an old phone camera balanced on a table, which I'm working under. I did make one big mistake during this process. When mixing more white paint with fabric medium, I shook the tube of paint too much and a glob of white paint landed on the fabric, in a space near the bottom of the moth, but not near enough for me to change the design to cover that area. I washed the paint off as best I could with a damp cloth, and the stain is at least gone, but that patch of fabric is slightly stiff and slightly too light. When I'd finished the white layer, I let the shirt dry overnight, then got back to work the next afternoon. I mixed 2 tubs of paint, starting with a muted yellow-brown, then using some of that paint mixed with a lot of white to make an off-white colour. These 2 paint colours, as well as some brown straight from a tube, are the colours of the highlights and shadows of all the bones in this image. I started by painting the owl skull, starting with the shadow inside its beak, although annoyingly I put my head right between the camera and the part of the shirt I was painting, so it's hard to see what I'm doing. Sorry. Luckily, when I moved on from the bottom jaw to the main section of the skull, my head wasn't blocking my art anymore. I first put down a flat layer of my off-white paint, then went back when it was still wet to shade it with my brown. I used that brown to draw the enormous eye socket of an owl skull, which has 2 different shades of shadow according to my reference image. I left the beak for later when I finished all the bones in the image, then moved on to the other bird skull, for which I used a crow skull for reference. Again, I painted it all in a flat colour, then shaded with brown on the wet paint. This skull has smaller eye sockets, and the middle section of the socket is darker, painted in a shade of brown that is almost the same as the background. I also shaded a hole for the visible nostril, or at least the part of the nostril that's bone-coloured rather than the black colour of the beak. The top skull in the design is meant to be a frog skull, but frog skulls are very complicated with a lot of delicate details, so I'm not sure I drew it very well. When showing a friend my design, he guessed that it was a lizard head, so there's that. He also watches these videos, so hi, I've mentioned you. On this skull, I was a bit inconsistent with how I shaded the eye sockets. On all the other skulls, I filled in the socket shadow with dark brown paint, even though it looks the same as the fabric colour, just for texture consistency. However, the frog's eye is unpainted. I don't have a reason for this design choice, I think I just forgot to paint it. The central skull in this design is a cat skull. This one is more detailed and complicated than the other skulls I've painted so far, so I took it in pieces, starting with the teeth and jaw. I shaded the jawbone and overlapping teeth before adding any colour to the upper section of the skull. I made sure to add shadows around the teeth to make them stand out against the bone, since otherwise they are the same colour. For this skull, I also changed my previous method of painting the whole thing before adding shading. I shaded as I went, worried that my paint would dry too quickly to blend otherwise, since this skull is larger and takes more time to fill than the others. I should also mention at this point that these are not in scale to each other. The wolf skull I haven't started painting yet is tiny compared to the cat skull, and the frog skull is enormous. I don't know how large the species of moths I'm painting are, but I'm sure they aren't in scale either, to each other or to the skulls. This is an abstract design, not a scientifically accurate one. I finished the cat skull by shading the eye socket and nose hole. At this point I was fighting the sun. I prefer working in the shade, both for the sake of the camera trying to avoid overexposing my art, and for my pale, sunburn-prone skin. However, it was late in the afternoon and the sun was coming in under the awning. I was using blankets and chairs to try and block it, but it was still annoying. While the sun wasn't shining directly on the shirt, it was shining on my head and hair, so every time my head ended up in frame, the camera would adjust the brightness to compensate, making the shirt appear darker. This section of the speed paint may be flashing a bit because of this. On top of all that, my head was fully in the way of the camera for most of the process of painting the wolf skull. What you can't see behind my head is that I filled in the skull and jaw, shaded them fairly simply, and then went back to work on the inside of the mouth in dark brown. I finally moved out of my own way when I started painting the teeth, of which there are quite a few. When the wolf skull was complete, I mixed some shades of dark brown and black, and went back to the bird skulls to paint their beaks. I started with the owl's beak. It's fairly simple, mostly dark grey with black shadows and a lighter grey highlight. The crow's beak is painted in the same method, working around its nostril hole. And with that, the skulls are done, and I'm moving on to the moths, starting with the top moth in the design. This is a Hercules moth, and in the reference photo I was using, it appeared a reddish brown, although in other photos it looks darker or lighter. I went with the reddish look. I started by placing down some reddish-brown paint at the tips of the wings, then blending it with a darker shadow along the edges and a light shade along the tails of the bottom wings. I added some final brushstroke details to the outer section of the wings, then added a flat reddish-brown color to the inner section. The wings of this moth species are divided into two clear sections, an outer and an inner section of pattern. Along that divide there are stripes of light and dark. I painted the light first, feathering one edge out and leaving the other side of the stripe sharp. I then added a dark line and detailed the part of the wing right next to the moth's body. The Hercules moth has 4 triangle-shaped spots on its wings, one on each wing. These triangles are dark and outlined in a lighter color. I painted those, then quickly painted the reddish-brown body, with the antenna and several white stripes. I then moved on to the next moth. The bottom moth in this design is the Atlas moth, which was recommended to me when I was first creating this design by the same friend who guessed the frog skull was a lizard. The Atlas moth also happens to be his favorite moth. This time I started by painting the inner section of this moth, also a reddish-brown. However, between painting the Hercules moth and the Atlas moth, I fetched 2 more tubes of paint, red and yellow ochre, rather than trying to mix the perfect shade myself. My friend told me that the unusually shaped upper wingtips of the Atlas moth are shaped like snakeheads, as a means of scaring away predators. I made sure that that part of my moth painting looked correct. I painted the tips of the wings in a light brown, then added what looks like eyes and mouths. I then detailed the rest of the outer wings. Like the Hercules moth, the Atlas moth's wings are separated into pattern sections with a stripe of white and dark. It also has the same triangle-shaped patches on the wings, although these ones are light with dark outlines, rather than the opposite on the Hercules moth. I finished detailing the top pair of wings before moving on to the bottom pair, which have a very similar pattern to the top. I did have to repaint the top triangles to match the bottom ones, as I had to remix my light-colored paint. I added stripes to the moth's body, gave them antennae, then added a few final details before moving on to the last moth, and the last section of this project. Throughout this whole project, I had been struggling with storage space on my phone. Every few clips, I'd have to pause my process to transfer my videos to my computer, then delete them from my phone to free up space to keep recording. It was really quite a tedious process, especially when I ran out of space on my computer as well, and had to transfer a bunch of old files to a hard drive. Despite all this, the storage got away from me, and I ran out of space while recording the painting of the last moth. Luckily I noticed before too long, but I did lose a few minutes of recording, so the video jumps from just starting to paint the wings to the background color of the wings being complete. This moth is the virgin tiger moth, and the reference photo I'm using shows it in a yellowish color with black patterns on its wings. Other tiger moths appear more red than yellow, but I prefer the look of the yellow ones. The tiger moth has very striking patterns on its body and wings, which I tried my best to replicate. It almost looks like a reverse-stained glass, pale outlines around triangular sections of black. The bottom pair of wings have more spot-like patterns, round rather than sharp. This is one of the more complicated clothing items I've painted, but it definitely isn't the one that's taken the longest. I'm still glad it's done. It was really fun to paint, but the issues with recording were annoying. However, despite all my setbacks with my crappy camera, the sun, and my storage issues, I think the shirt came out really well. I really like bones, and I've grown to like moths more and more in the last few months. I think this shirt will fit right into my wardrobe, and I'm super excited to start wearing it. This design was really complicated, so I won't be creating more to sell, but I do have other hand-painted shirts available for purchase on my Etsy store, linked in my bio. I hope you enjoyed watching my painting process, and I'd love to hear what you think of the result. This video took a while, so I'd love it if you supported me by liking the video and subscribing. Until next time, bye!